My sister claimed I was a danger to my own kids, so I made sure she lost custody. I'm a 34-year-old single dad to two amazing kids, my son who's 8, and my daughter who's 5. Life hasn't always been easy, but I've worked hard to build a stable, happy home for us. My sister, Danielle, is 37, married to Jacob, and they have 2 kids, a 10-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. On paper, Danielle's life is picture perfect, a 6-figure corporate job, a big house in the suburbs, and a stay-at-home husband who seems to have everything under control. But trust me, it's not as perfect as it looks. Danielle and I have never been close. Growing up, she was the golden child, the one who followed all the rules, got straight A's, and made our parents proud. Meanwhile, I was the rebellious one, the kid who questioned authority, made mistakes, and, according to my parents, gave them gray hairs. Danielle loved to rub her success in my face even back then. She was the kind of sister who'd get an A on a test and make sure to leave it where I'd see it, just to remind me how easy it was to be perfect. Our relationship didn't improve much as adults. Danielle's always had this superiority complex. She likes to pretend she's offering helpful advice, but it's always been thinly veiled criticism of my choices. When I decided to become a freelance graphic designer, she told me it was a hobby job and asked if I'd thought about what kind of example I was setting for my kids. When my son took up dance instead of soccer, Danielle acted like I doomed him to a life of bullying. And don't even get me started on the time she asked if I was saving for therapy because my daughter's favorite color is black and not pink. That's just Danielle. The most recent family gathering is where things really started to spiral. It was a backyard barbecue at our parents' house, a rare occasion where everyone showed up. My kids were running around with their cousins, laughing and having a great time. But of course, Danielle had to make a comment loud enough for everyone to hear. She said something about how I let my kids run wild and how it's no surprise they never listen to anyone. I laughed it off in the moment because I've learned not to let her get under my skin, but I could feel the judgment from Jacob's side eye as he sat there, probably mentally comparing my parenting to their color-coded chore charts and screen time schedules. Danielle and Jacob are the definition of helicopter parents. Their kids aren't allowed to eat sugar, stay up past 7:30, or watch anything that isn't educational. Jacob is always posting these Pinterest-worthy pictures of their family game nights or homemade science projects, but their kids always look tired. It's like they're being raised in a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, Danielle acts like being a mom is a side hustle. She works long hours and spends most of her time at family events scrolling on her phone, only stepping in to bark orders or criticize someone else. About a week after the barbecue, my mom called me, clearly uncomfortable. She told me she'd heard from some extended family members that Danielle had been saying some pretty nasty things about me. Apparently, she'd been telling people I'm unfit to be a parent because I'm too lenient and that my unstable lifestyle is going to ruin my kids. She even hinted that someone should call Child Protective Services to step in before it's too late. I was stunned. It's one thing to criticize me to my face, but to go behind my back and say things like that? To involve CPS? That's a whole new level of betrayal. A few days later, my worst fear came true. There was a knock at my door, and standing there were 2 CPS workers. They said they'd received an anonymous report about unsafe living conditions and neglect. My heart was racing, but I let them in. They were polite but thorough, asking questions about everything from my kids' diet to their sleeping arrangements. They even spoke to my son and daughter who, bless them, were confused but cooperative. After about an hour, the workers told me everything looked fine and they'd be closing the case. Still, the experience left me shaken. At the next family event, I decided to confront Danielle. I didn't accuse her outright, but I asked if she knew anything about the CPS report. She smirked and said something about how people just want what's best for the kids, and sometimes it takes an outsider to see the bigger picture. It was all I could do not to scream. My parents were furious when they found out, but they refused to cut ties with Danielle, saying it was important to keep the family together. Jacob, of course, stood by his wife, claiming they'd only ever acted out of love because I'm too selfish to put my kids first. That's when I knew I couldn't trust them. I started keeping a journal of everything. Every passive-aggressive comment. Every questionable thing I noticed about their parenting. At family gatherings, I started paying closer attention to their kids who seemed more withdrawn every time I saw them. I didn't know where this was heading, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Danielle and Jacob get away with this. Update 1. Things started to unravel not long after the CPS visit. I was scrolling through my messages one evening when a notification popped up from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was an old friend of Jacob's. Someone he'd been close to before marrying Danielle, but had drifted apart from. She started by asking if everything was okay, which immediately made me suspicious. Then she dropped a bombshell. Jacob had been venting about his marriage on private online forums. Apparently, he was struggling with Danielle's controlling behavior and felt trapped. According to the messages, Danielle's need for control extended far beyond the kids. She micromanaged every aspect of their lives from their schedules to their finances. Jacob had even admitted in one post that he sometimes felt like another one of her children instead of her husband. The friend didn't have screenshots but suggested I check Danielle and Jacob's social media accounts for clues. That night, I went down the rabbit hole. Danielle's social media was plastered with pictures of their perfect family vacation photos, holiday dinners, and happy birthday posts. But the more I looked, the more cracks I noticed. Jacob often looked tense, and the kids rarely smiled naturally in the photos. It was like they were performing for an audience. There were also comments from Jacob's personal account that seemed a little off. He would write things like "another busy week, but we made it through," or "always so proud of my family." Statements that sounded like they were trying to convince someone, maybe himself, that everything was fine. The next family gathering wasn't any better. It was another barbecue at our parents' house, and Danielle's kids seemed exhausted. Her youngest kept yawning, and the oldest flinched whenever Danielle raised her voice, even if it wasn't directed at them. They were quieter than usual too, barely engaging with my kids. At one point, Jacob and I ended up in the kitchen together, and he let slip that his oldest had been having trouble in school. They'd started seeing a therapist for anxiety, but Danielle thought therapy was a waste of time and only allowed it because the school recommended it. That caught my attention. After the barbecue, I decided to dig a little deeper. I reached out to a mutual acquaintance who worked at the kids' school. She didn't give me specific details but mentioned that one of Danielle's kids had been struggling with anxiety, and a teacher had expressed concerns about the pressure they seemed to be under. The teacher also mentioned the child often seemed tired and on edge, which lined up with what I'd been noticing at family events. Around this time, I reconnected with Jacob's old friend who shared more troubling stories. She told me that Danielle was known to yell at her kids when things didn't go perfectly. Jacob had once confided in her that Danielle's temper scared him, but he didn't feel like he could leave because he wasn't working and had no financial independence. The friend seemed genuinely worried, and so was I. Danielle must have sensed that I was paying more attention because she started ramping up her attacks. At the next family dinner, I had a single glass of wine with my meal. It was a rare treat since I don't drink much. Danielle, ever the opportunist, loudly commented on how I always have a drink in hand and made a joke about me being the family's resident lush. It was ridiculous, but the way she framed it made it sound like I was an alcoholic. I knew it wasn't just a jab. It was another attempt to undermine me in front of the family. After that, I started researching custody laws and what constitutes neglect or emotional abuse. It wasn't about revenge anymore. I was genuinely worried about my nieces and nephews. I began keeping meticulous records of everything. Every snide comment Danielle made, every detail I noticed about her kids' behavior, and even Jacob's subtle admissions. I saved screenshots of social media posts and started writing down things I overheard at family events. I debated anonymously reporting Danielle to CPS, but I decided to wait until I had enough evidence. I didn't want to risk having my report dismissed or, worse, tipping her off before I could make a real case. The final straw came at another family gathering. Danielle was in full performance mode, talking loudly about how her parenting style was the reason her kids were so well behaved. Then, out of nowhere, she announced that my kids were probably going to end up in juvie if I didn't parent better. The room went silent. I looked over at my parents who were clearly uncomfortable but said nothing. Later, one of my cousins pulled me aside and admitted she believed Danielle was emotionally abusive to her kids but was afraid to speak up because of how intimidating she could be. Not long after that, Jacob sent me a cryptic text. He apologized for Danielle's behavior, calling it unnecessary. But when I tried to respond, he quickly backtracked, saying he shouldn't have said anything and asking me to ignore the message. It was clear he was scared. At this point, I started noticing Danielle's hypocrisy more and more. Despite her hands-on mom image, she frequently worked late and left Jacob to handle everything at home. The cracks in her perfect facade were becoming impossible to ignore. I decided it was time to act, not to get back at Danielle, but to protect her kids. The more I learned, the clearer it became that they were the ones who needed help. Update 2. After the last family gathering, I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start taking action. I contacted a family lawyer to discuss everything. Danielle's behavior, her CPS stunt, and my concerns for her kids. The lawyer listened carefully and offered clear advice: document everything and focus on facts, not emotions. She also reassured me that as long as I kept my own parenting spotless, there was no way Danielle's retaliation could jeopardize my custody of my kids. Following her advice, I began reaching out to family members and friends who had witnessed Danielle's outbursts. Some were hesitant to get involved, but others, like my cousin, who had already confided in me, agreed to provide written statements. Each account painted a clear picture. Danielle was controlling, quick to anger, and dismissive of her children's emotions. I also reconnected with Jacob's old friend, who came through with screenshots of Jacob's private posts from years ago. These posts described Danielle's yelling, her refusal to compromise on parenting decisions, and his increasing feelings of isolation. The pieces were starting to come together. Then I had an opportunity to see things firsthand. I casually offered to help Jacob with school pickup one afternoon. He reluctantly agreed, probably overwhelmed and needing the extra hands. As we waited for the kids, I overheard a conversation between his oldest child and another student. The girl mentioned skipping lunch because mom said I was getting chubby. My stomach turned. Later, I gently asked Jacob about it, and he admitted that Danielle had been obsessing over the kids' eating habits, even going as far as to remove snacks from the house entirely. That was the tipping point. I filed an anonymous report with CPS detailing everything I documented. I kept the focus on the kids, their anxiety, their apparent exhaustion, and the unhealthy pressure Danielle seemed to put on them. A few weeks later, CPS conducted a surprise visit to Danielle's home. While they didn't find evidence of physical abuse, they noted a high level of tension in the household and scheduled a follow-up. Danielle's carefully curated image was beginning to crumble. When news of the CPS visit got back to her, Danielle was furious. She confronted me at a family dinner, loudly accusing me of being behind the report. I denied it, keeping my expression neutral, and she stormed off. The rest of the family was left in an awkward silence, but I noticed a few of them exchanging knowing glances. It was clear that more people were starting to see through Danielle's act. The confrontation seemed to push Jacob to his breaking point. A few days later, he showed up at my house visibly shaken. For the first time, he openly admitted how bad things were at home. Danielle's yelling wasn't just reserved for the kids. It extended to him too. She criticized everything he did, from how he managed the house to how he handled the kids' schedules. He confessed that he'd been thinking about leaving her but didn't know where to start. I gave him a list of resources: men's shelters, financial planning services, and legal aid. I also encouraged him to keep his own documentation, texts, emails, anything that could help if he decided to file for divorce. Meanwhile, Danielle doubled down on her behavior. She pulled her oldest child out of therapy, calling it a waste of time and insisting that their problems could be solved with discipline. This only made things worse. Jacob's old friend, who had stayed in touch with me, shared more screenshots of Jacob venting about Danielle's decisions. The messages were damning, with Jacob explicitly mentioning how Danielle's actions were hurting their kids and how powerless he felt to stop it. I also reached out to the kids' teachers, framing it as a concerned relative wanting to ensure the kids were okay. Without prying too much, I encouraged them to document any concerns they noticed. One teacher later mentioned offhand that they'd already been keeping notes after the oldest child broke down in class during a group project. Danielle's public persona started to crack. At the next family event, she lost her temper in front of everyone, yelling at her youngest child for spilling a drink. The room went silent as the child shrank back, clearly scared. My parents looked horrified, but no one said anything. Except for Jacob, who quietly led the kids out of the room. Later, a few family members privately approached me, acknowledging that they were starting to see what I'd been talking about. The turning point came when I got a hold of a voicemail. Jacob had accidentally forwarded it to me while we were discussing resources. In it, Danielle berated him for not controlling the kids better, calling him useless and blaming him for their struggles in school. The tone was harsh, the language degrading. It was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to show the extent of her behavior. With the voicemail in hand, I went back to my lawyer. She helped me craft a plan to ensure Jacob and the kids could get the help they needed while protecting myself and my own children from Danielle's retaliation. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability and safety. And for the first time, it felt like Danielle's house of cards was about to come crashing down. Update 3. Not long after I received that voicemail of Danielle berating Jacob, things began to escalate quickly. A few weeks later, CPS showed up at Danielle's house again. This time, it wasn't because of my report. One of the teachers at her kids' school had anonymously reached out after noticing that Danielle's oldest had been crying in class and expressed fear of going home. CPS conducted another home visit, which only seemed to amplify the tension in their household. Though no physical abuse was found, the investigator made note of the emotional strain on the children and flagged the case for continued monitoring. Danielle's reaction to the second visit was explosive. She started pointing fingers at everyone in the family, accusing various people of working with CPS to sabotage her. She went so far as to accuse our parents, who had remained cautiously neutral until this point. Her paranoia only served to alienate her further from the extended family. Cousins who once defended her began to quietly distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged into her drama. Amid this chaos, Jacob opened up to me again. One evening, he showed up unannounced, looking exhausted and stressed. For the first time, he fully admitted that Danielle's abuse wasn't limited to the kids. It extended to him as well. She would belittle him, blame him for anything that went wrong, and control every aspect of their lives, including their finances. He confessed he'd considered leaving but felt trapped because he had no savings and no support system outside of the family. It was heartbreaking, but it also gave me a clear path forward. We started quietly building an exit plan for him. First, I helped him research local men's shelters and legal aid organizations. Then, we opened a separate bank account in his name, hidden from Danielle, where he could start putting away small amounts of money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I also put him in touch with my lawyer, who began advising him on the legal steps he'd need to take if he decided to file for divorce and custody. Meanwhile, Danielle began targeting me directly. She cornered me at a family event, her face red with anger, and warned me that she'd make sure I lost custody of my kids if I didn't stay out of her business. I stayed calm, refusing to engage, but I made a mental note to document the interaction. Danielle's threats were empty, but they showed just how desperate she was becoming. Around this time, a new witness emerged. A neighbor of Danielle's approached me at a community event. They'd overheard a heated argument between Danielle and her oldest child, where Danielle had been shouting so loudly that the neighbor could hear every word through their closed windows. They described the language Danielle used as intimidating and said it left them concerned for the kids' well-being. The neighbor offered to provide a statement if it was ever needed, which felt like a significant win. The real turning point came at another family gathering. Danielle's oldest child pulled me aside while the adults were distracted. They admitted they felt scared all the time and didn't like going home. When I gently asked if they'd ever told anyone else, they shook their head, looking terrified of the consequences. It was clear they were desperate for help, but they didn't know how to ask for it. A few days later, I decided to confront Danielle directly in a neutral setting. I carefully laid out what I'd observed, her kids' anxiety, Jacob's exhaustion, and the reports from CPS, and tried to reason with her. Instead of listening, she doubled down, accusing me of being a homewrecker who was trying to ruin her family out of jealousy. It was pointless to argue, so I left, knowing that her refusal to acknowledge her behavior would only work against her in the long run. As Danielle's erratic behavior became more obvious, more family members began siding with me. My cousin, who had previously kept her distance, started actively supporting Jacob. Even our parents, who had tried to stay neutral for so long, began stepping in to support the kids, offering to babysit more frequently and subtly helping Jacob with small errands. With encouragement from all sides, Jacob finally took a significant step forward. He quietly met with a family lawyer who helped him understand his rights and options. He began gathering his own evidence, texts, emails, and even recordings of some of Danielle's outbursts. With my help, he started building a custody case that would stand up in court. Then came the breaking point. At a family dinner, Danielle had a complete meltdown. It started over something small. Her youngest child accidentally spilled their drink, but it escalated into a full-blown shouting match. She yelled at Jacob in front of everyone, calling him useless, and berated her kids until they were in tears. The room was dead silent, everyone too stunned to speak. Jacob stood up, took the kids, and left without a word. After that, there was no going back. Jacob finalized his plans to leave and began preparing the legal paperwork to file for divorce and full custody. Meanwhile, I compiled all the evidence he collected along with my own notes to create a comprehensive case against Danielle. Danielle's kids started refusing to participate in family outings, citing anxiety. CPS began visiting more frequently, keeping a closer eye on the household. The family began rallying around Jacob, and Danielle found herself increasingly isolated. Jacob thanked me for my support and promised to see the process through. As we both prepared for what was to come, it was clear that Danielle's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The worst was still ahead for her, at least. For Jacob and the kids, the future was finally starting to look brighter. Update 4. The turning point came when Jacob officially filed for divorce and requested full custody of the kids. The legal paperwork outlined everything: emotional abuse, controlling behavior, and a toxic home environment. It was the culmination of months of planning, evidence gathering, and quiet determination. Danielle was blindsided. True to form, her first response wasn't self-reflection, it was retaliation. Danielle immediately tried to block Jacob's access to their joint bank account. He discovered this when his card was declined while trying to buy groceries for the kids. Fortunately, we'd anticipated this move. Jacob had already set up his own account with the help of my lawyer, and I stepped in to cover his immediate expenses until he could get everything sorted. It was a small victory, but it gave Jacob the confidence to keep pushing forward. Danielle didn't stop there. He launched a full-blown smear campaign against both Jacob and me, calling family members and mutual friends to set the record straight. She told anyone who would listen that Jacob's divorce filing was a lie orchestrated by me, claiming I'd manipulated him into leaving her out of revenge. She painted herself as a victim, insisting she was just a strict but loving mother, and that Jacob was too emotional to handle parenting. It was exhausting, but most of the family had already seen her true colors. The people who mattered weren't buying her story. When the legal proceedings began, Jacob's lawyer came out swinging. The evidence was overwhelming. There were testimonies from teachers who had noticed the kids' anxiety, screenshots of Jacob's private complaints about Danielle's controlling behavior, and documentation from CPS about the emotional strain in the household. Danielle tried to fight back by filing her own custody request, accusing Jacob of being an unfit father. She even tried to drag me into it, claiming I was orchestrating everything out of jealousy. It was laughable, but it showed just how desperate she was. The most powerful moment came when the kids were interviewed by their court-appointed guardian. Both of them said they felt safer with Jacob and didn't want to live with Danielle full time. Their oldest even brought up Danielle's habit of yelling and how it made them feel scared. Hearing their voices added weight to Jacob's case and made it clear that this wasn't just a messy divorce. It was about protecting the kids from further harm. When I was called to testify, I kept my focus on the facts. I described Danielle's history of undermining Jacob's parenting, her volatile temper, and the effect it had on her children. I presented screenshots, documented incidents, and even the voicemail she'd accidentally left, berating Jacob. Danielle's lawyer tried to discredit me, implying that I was biased because of my strained relationship with Danielle, but the evidence spoke for itself. There was no spinning the mountain of proof against her. Danielle's attempts to bring in character witnesses backfired spectacularly. A few people initially agreed to testify on her behalf, but most backed out before the trial. Those who did show up crumbled under cross-examination, admitting that they'd witnessed her controlling behavior or heard about her outbursts. Instead of strengthening her case, they made her look worse. Meanwhile, Jacob received overwhelming support from the community. Teachers, family friends, and neighbors wrote letters attesting to his fitness as a parent and the toxic environment Danielle had created. Even people who had stayed neutral up to this point began quietly siding with him. The tide was turning, and Danielle was losing control. The courtroom drama hit its peak when Danielle lost her temper during a hearing. It started with a minor disagreement about scheduling, but she escalated quickly, yelling at Jacob and even snapping at the judge. The judge warned her to control herself, but the damage was done. Her outburst only confirmed what everyone already suspected. Danielle's temper was a major issue, and her home wasn't a safe environment for the kids. The fallout from her courtroom behavior rippled through the family. Those who had been on the fence finally cut ties with her, siding with Jacob and offering their support. Danielle found herself increasingly isolated, and her desperation became more apparent. As the date for the final custody ruling approached, Jacob's lawyer expressed confidence that the judge would rule in his favor. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Danielle tried to discredit me. She dug up old personal information, stuff from years ago that had no bearing on the case, and tried to leak it to the family. It was a pathetic move, and it backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me look bad, it made Danielle look petty and desperate. The family's opinion of her sank even lower, and I didn't even have to defend myself. Her actions spoke louder than any words I could have said. Now we're in the waiting game. The custody ruling is just around the corner, and there's nothing more we can do. The evidence has been presented. The witnesses have spoken, and the kids' voices have been heard. All we can do is wait and hope that justice prevails. No matter what happens, I know one thing for sure. Danielle's reign of control is coming to an end. The future for Jacob, for the kids, and for everyone she's hurt is finally starting to look brighter. Update 5. The custody ruling finally came in, and it was everything we had hoped for. The judge granted Jacob full custody of the kids, citing the overwhelming evidence of Danielle's emotional abuse and toxic behavior. Danielle was given limited supervised visitation, a decision that hit her hard. The judge also ordered her to attend anger management classes and parenting courses before she could even request unsupervised visits. It was a clear acknowledgement of the damage she had caused, and it was the first real step toward protecting Jacob and the kids from her control. The aftermath of the ruling was not kind to Danielle. Her reputation, already shaky after her courtroom meltdown, took a nosedive. The family and community that had once respected her now saw her for who she really was. Even her staunchest allies started to pull away. It was as if everyone realized at once that her strict parenting was just a cover for her controlling, abusive nature. Without her facade of perfection, Danielle was left isolated and humiliated. Meanwhile, Jacob and the kids began their new life. He moved into a smaller but cozy home in a nearby neighborhood where the kids could stay in the same schools. The change was immediate. The kids seemed lighter, freer. Therapy became a regular part of their lives. And their oldest, who had struggled with anxiety and fear, started to open up more in school and at home. Teachers began reporting significant improvements in behavior and participation. The youngest, too, blossomed in the calmer, supportive environment that Jacob created. The ripple effect of the custody battle reached the rest of the family too. Relatives who had stayed on the fence throughout the drama began reaching out to me, apologizing for not believing me sooner. They admitted they had brushed off my warnings about Danielle for years, but now, after seeing everything unfold, they couldn't ignore the truth. It felt vindicating, but it was also bittersweet. Their apologies came too late to undo the harm Danielle had caused, but at least they were finally taking accountability. Danielle, of course, couldn't let things go. She attempted to rebuild her image on social media, posting staged pictures of herself during supervised visits with the kids and captions about how much she loved being a mom. But the response wasn't what she hoped for. Her posts were met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright ridicule. It was clear that her attempts to save face weren't fooling anyone. The community saw through her efforts, and her once perfect image was permanently tarnished. As for Jacob, he started thriving in ways no one could have predicted. With the weight of Danielle's control lifted, he began exploring his independence. He took a part-time job at a local boutique, something Danielle would have never allowed him to do before, and started thinking about going back to school to finish his degree. His confidence grew day by day, and he became a role model for his kids in a way he hadn't been able to before. The resolution of the custody battle also had a positive impact on my own family. With the drama behind us, my kids no longer had to witness the tension that had hung over every family gathering for years. They started thriving in their own activities, and our home became a much happier, calmer place. It was a reminder of how much stress Danielle's behavior had brought into all our lives. One unexpected bright spot came from Jacob's old friend, the one who had initially reached out to me with the screenshots of Danielle's online posts. He reconnected with Jacob after the divorce, offering emotional support and even helping him navigate the early days of single parenting. It was heartwarming to see Jacob rebuilding his support network and surrounding himself with people who genuinely cared about his well-being. Danielle's struggles didn't end with her reputation. The financial strain of legal fees, child support payments, and court-ordered classes started to take its toll. She had to downsize her own lifestyle significantly, selling off the flashy car she used to flaunt at family gatherings and cutting back on the luxuries she'd once bragged about. It was a sharp contrast to the image she had tried so hard to maintain, and it left her with even less power to control Jacob or the kids. Eventually, CPS closed the case, declaring Jacob's home safe and stable. The kids were thriving, and there was no need for further intervention. Danielle, however, remained on their radar, with occasional check-ins tied to her supervised visitation. It was a clear message that the system wasn't going to let her slip through the cracks. Toward the end of it all, Danielle tried to make amends with me. She approached me at a family event, offering what felt like a half-hearted apology for everything she'd done. I listened, but when she finished, I told her plainly that her actions were unforgivable. She had put Jacob, the kids, and me through hell, and no amount of apologies could erase that. I made it clear that while I hoped she could grow and do better, I wasn't interested in rebuilding any kind of relationship with her. As I reflect on everything, it's hard to believe how far we've come. What started as a simple family rivalry spiraled into something so much bigger, but in the end, justice was served. Jacob and the kids are safe, thriving, and finally free from Danielle's control. My own family has found peace again, and the extended family is starting to heal. While there's still a long road ahead for everyone involved, I'm hopeful for the future. For the first time in years, it feels like we're all moving forward on our terms and without Danielle's shadow hanging over us.